The moment I saw it, my whole body went cold. Not afraid cold, but recognition cold. The kind of cold that reaches back 22 years and pulls something out of the dark where you buried it. I had spent 2 decades being told I was wrong, that I misremembered, that grief does things to the mind. And then he walked into that conference room, rolled up his sleeve, and I saw it. The mark. The exact mark. And I knew, whatever my life had been up to that morning, it was never to be that life again. That was Margaret Calloway. And what she did next, quietly, methodically, over the next 11 months, is the reason this story exists. This is the story of a woman who was told her son died at birth, who spent 22 years carrying a grief that never quite fit, and who walked into work one ordinary Tuesday morning and found something that should not have been possible. The question at the center of everything she then did is this: when you have been told for your entire adult life that a truth cannot exist, and then it stands in front of you in a conference room, what do you owe the life you built in the meantime? There are 3 things most people believe about grief. They believe it fades. They believe it eventually stops asking questions. And they believe that if you have lived with a wound long enough, you reach a point where the wound stops mattering as much as the life you built around it. Margaret Calloway had spent 22 years testing all 3 of those assumptions, and by the time she accepted the position at Harman and Reach Consulting in the spring of 2019, she had arrived at something that looked, from the outside, very much like peace. She had a career she had built with precision and intelligence. She had a home. She had a routine that held her days in place, the way a frame holds a photograph. But there was something in the center of the frame she had never been able to fill, and she had learned over 2 decades simply not to look directly at it. What she could not have known, on the morning she drove to her first day at the new firm and parked in the underground garage and rode the elevator to the 4th floor, was that the thing she had learned not to look at was about to look back. She picked up her visitor badge from the front desk. A woman named Sandra, who had worked there 11 years, showed her to her office, a clean, glass-walled space that faced north, with a view of the street below and a small potted plant on the windowsill that someone had left behind, and that Margaret would water every Tuesday for the next 7 months, without ever being told whose plant it was. She set her bag on the desk. She opened her laptop. She began what she believed was a new chapter. She had no way of knowing that the chapter had in fact already been written. The tension that runs under this entire story is not the tension of a mystery, though there is one. It is not the tension of a crime, though one was committed. It is the tension of certainty, of a woman who had been told, repeatedly and gently and with great care, that the thing she remembered most clearly from the worst night of her life was not real. That is a particular kind of cruelty. Not the cruelty of someone trying to harm you. The cruelty of people who love you and genuinely believe they are helping. The cruelty of being surrounded by well-meaning hands that keep trying to lift a weight they have decided you are not allowed to carry. Margaret Calloway had been carrying it for 22 years. She had learned to carry it quietly, and quietly she had never let it go. Margaret was born in Macon, Georgia, the younger of 2 daughters. Her mother was a school teacher. Her father worked for the county water authority and coached youth baseball on Saturday mornings with the kind of steady, uncomplicated dedication that Margaret would spend the rest of her life trying to understand and replicate. She was not an extraordinary child in any way that the world tends to recognize. She was not particularly loud or particularly brilliant. She was attentive. She noticed things. She had the quality, rare in the young and rarer still in adults, of being fully present in a room, as if her attention were a kind of gift she gave without being asked. Her teachers noticed it. Her mother noticed it. It made people feel, without being able to explain why, that Margaret was someone worth talking to. She left Macon at 21 to study business administration at a state university 2 hours north, and she stayed north after graduating, working first as an administrative coordinator for a mid-sized logistics company, and later, after completing her MBA at 27, as a junior consultant at a regional firm outside of Atlanta. She was 28 when she found out she was pregnant. The father was a man named Raymond, a broad-shouldered, quietly funny man who worked construction and had the quality of seeming, in any situation, entirely unrushable. He was not a bad man. He was simply not a man who could hold the shape of himself under pressure, and a pregnancy, it turned out, was more pressure than Raymond's shape could hold. He stayed through the first 4 months. He painted the nursery a soft green. He assembled the crib from a box. And then, the way some people do, he simply began to disappear. Margaret did not name her son until she was alone in the hospital room in the second week of her admission, 11 days before the delivery. She lay in the adjustable bed in the room that smelled of industrial cleaner and something almost floral underneath, and she turned the name over in her mind the way you turn something smooth in your hand, feeling its shape, testing its weight. Thomas, her grandfather's name, a man who had shown up every day of his life without drama or announcement, who had taught her that dependability was not the absence of feeling, but the decision to be present regardless of it. She wanted that for her child. She wanted a name that meant something before it was given. She had a girl's name ready too, but it was Thomas that she returned to in the quiet of those 11 nights. When she talked to him through the thin wall of herself and told him what the world looked like from where she was. On the morning of December 19th, 1997, Margaret went into labor. It was faster than anyone expected. There had been a shift change earlier that morning. Faces she had come to recognize over 11 days were replaced by faces she had never seen. The doctor who had been managing her care was off duty. A different doctor appeared. She did not catch his name. She was not, in that hour, in a position to ask. What she remembered afterward, what she would remember for the next 22 years, unchanged, through two therapists and a grief counselor and more well-meaning conversations than she could count, was the cry. It was brief. 4 seconds, she has always said, perhaps 5. But it was real, and it was her son, and then a nurse moved quickly across the room, and then the sound stopped. And then a different nurse sat on the edge of her bed and told her, with kind eyes, that Thomas had not survived. She asked to hold him. She was told gently that it would be better if she did not, that it would make it harder. She accepted this. She was 28 years old, she had just delivered, and a nurse with a soft voice was explaining what was better for her grief. She signed the cremation form 2 days later because she did not know what else there was to do. She drove home from the hospital with her mother beside her in the passenger seat, and neither of them spoke for most of the 40-minute drive. And when they arrived at the house, the green nursery door was closed, and it stayed closed for 3 weeks. Raymond's toolbox was still in the corner of the kitchen. She put it in the hallway. Someone, she does not remember who, eventually took it away. She disassembled the crib herself, packed it into its original box, left it at the end of the driveway with a sign that said, "Free." It was gone within the hour. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Margaret did in the months and years that followed the loss of Thomas is what most people who survive this kind of grief do. She moved forward because there was nowhere else to go. She went back to work. She found a new apartment. She started running in the early mornings before the city fully woke, and she found that movement helped her in a way that stillness did not. She changed firms twice in the first 3 years. Not because she was unhappy at either of them, but because staying felt, at the time, like a kind of admission that the life she was living was the life she had chosen. She had not chosen it. She was inhabiting it carefully, the way you inhabit a house that is not yet yours. The grief counselor she saw in her early 30s was a woman named Dr. Paula Simmons, who had a small office near the university and a framed print of a Matisse on the wall that Margaret found oddly comforting. Paula was patient and thorough and genuinely good at her work. She did not dismiss what Margaret told her about the cry. She simply offered the explanation that trauma can shape memory, that the mind in the most devastating moments sometimes gives us what we need to survive the moment rather than what was actually there. Margaret heard this. She considered it seriously. She held it in her mind for several weeks and turned it the way she turned the name Thomas in her hospital room. And she set it aside. Not because she thought Paula was wrong, because she thought Paula was explaining something real without having access to the specific truth of it. The cry had been real. She did not know how she knew. She simply knew. By the time she was 40, she had largely stopped telling people about the cry. Not because she had given up on it. Because she had learned in the particular way that the persistent learn these things, that the cost of telling someone was always higher than the cost of holding it alone. She would see it in their faces, the shift from open attention to careful attention, the slight adjustment of posture that meant they were now managing her rather than listening to her. She did not resent them for it. She understood the position they were in. A woman who insists for a decade that her son cried before they told her he was gone, who has no evidence and no documentation and no one who was present and agrees. That woman is asking something very difficult of the people who love her. Margaret had stopped asking. She had kept the knowledge folded and private. The way you keep something in a pocket you are not sure when you will need. Elliot Hargrove arrived at Harmon and Reach in October of 2019. Margaret had been there 7 months by then. She knew the rhythms of the office, which colleagues arrived early and which arrived apologetically late, which conference rooms had the best light, which of the two coffee machines produced something worth drinking. She had settled into the work with the same competent precision she brought to every role. She was good at seeing systems, at identifying the places where organizations were losing something they could not yet name. Her client retention numbers in her first 2 quarters were the highest in her practice group. She liked the work. She liked the clarity of it. Elliot Hargrove arrived with a reputation that preceded him by approximately 2 weeks. An email from the managing partners to the full firm, 3 paragraphs long, which described his client list and his former firm and his professional accomplishments, with the careful enthusiasm of an announcement that is also an instruction to pay attention. The first time Margaret was in the same room as Elliot Hargrove was a Thursday morning practice group meeting, 8 people around an oval table, where he was being introduced to the team rather than leading it. She noticed, as she always noticed about people, the quality of his stillness. He listened well. He asked one question, and the question was precise and showed he had read the briefing materials carefully. He shook hands at the end of the meeting and used people's names when he did it, which Margaret had long considered a reliable test of whether someone was actually paying attention. She took no particular note of the inner side of his forearms. There was no reason to. He was wearing a pressed blue shirt with the sleeves buttoned at the wrists. She gathered her folder, walked back to her office, and worked until 6:30. She drove home. She heated the soup she had made on Sunday. She did not think about Elliot Hargrove again until the following Tuesday. The meeting on that Tuesday was a quarterly performance review. 8 people around the same oval table, the same north-facing light coming in through the window, the same wall clock that ran 3 minutes fast, and that everyone had agreed, silently and collectively, to ignore. Elliot Hargrove was leading the session. He had been in the role officially for 9 days. He stood at the head of the table with the easy authority of someone who had been in many rooms like this one and had learned somewhere along the way that rooms respond to confidence the way water responds to a current. They simply move in its direction. His shirt that morning was a pale blue. The sleeves were rolled to the elbows. His right forearm rested against the edge of the table as he reviewed the document in front of him. And Margaret, sitting directly across the table with her own documents open in front of her, looked up and saw it. The birthmark was on the inner side of his right forearm, high up, near the elbow. It was dark, almost purple in certain lights, and irregular in shape, roughly circular, larger than a thumbprint but smaller than a palm. It had a small pale inclusion near its lower edge, a lighter area within the darker pigment, which gave it the appearance she had once described, in a hospital room in Georgia in December of 1997, as looking a little like a moon with a piece missing from it. She had seen that mark for 15 seconds in a delivery room. She had described it to a nurse and later to her mother and later to Paula Simmons. She had not forgotten a single detail of it in 22 years. She sat in that conference room and she looked at the forearm of a 44-year-old man, and every cell in her body went still. Not still like shock, still like recognition. The specific, absolute stillness of a thing falling into place. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. Margaret participated in it. She offered an analysis of a client retention problem in the 3rd quarter that one of her colleagues later described as characteristically sharp. She answered 2 direct questions from Elliot Hargrove with clarity and accuracy. She gathered her materials at the end when the meeting closed and walked back to her office and sat down at her desk without turning on her monitor. She sat there for 45 minutes. She was doing the arithmetic she could not stop doing. December of 1997, a male child. He would be 22 years old now. Elliot Hargrove was 44. These numbers did not align. She knew they did not align. She held that knowledge in one hand and the image of the birthmark in the other, and she did not move until her phone rang with a client call she had scheduled 10 days ago and completely forgotten. She drove home that evening without the radio on. She did not heat anything for dinner. She sat at her kitchen table under the overhead light and stared at the surface of the table, which was a plain wooden table she had bought at an estate sale 8 years ago, and refinished herself over a long weekend in October when she had needed something to do with her hands. She tried, carefully and honestly, to apply every explanation she had been given over the years to what she had seen that morning. She had seen something that reminded her of what she remembered. She had imposed the memory onto a detail. She had seen what she wanted to see, in the way that grief is known to do. She ran through each explanation. She gave each one the full weight of her attention, and when she was done, she was left with the same thing she had always been left with. She had not confused this. She had recognized it. There is a difference. She did not act on it immediately. That is one of the things about Margaret Calloway that this story requires you to understand from the beginning. She was not impulsive. She had spent 22 years practicing restraint in the face of something that urged her to be otherwise, and that practice had made her precise in a way that most people are not. She gave herself 2 weeks. She went to work each day. She completed her client deliverables. She attended 2 more meetings where Elliot Hargrove was present, and she watched him, carefully and without giving any indication that she was doing so, and she looked at the forearm whenever it was visible. The mark was always the same. The pale inclusion near the lower edge was always the same. After 2 weeks, she called Dale Whitmore, who had been recommended to her by an attorney she had worked with briefly 5 years earlier. Dale was a private investigator who had spent 20 years working insurance fraud before going independent. She met him in a coffee shop on a Wednesday afternoon and told him everything. Dale Whitmore would later describe Margaret as the most methodical client he had worked with in 3 decades. She arrived at the coffee shop with a folder. The folder contained a written timeline of the events of December 1997, a physical description of the birthmark as she had documented it from memory in 2 separate journal entries, one written in 1998 and one written in 2009, both of which describe the same mark in the same location with the same pale inclusion, and a printed copy of Elliot Hargrove's professional biography from the Harmon and Reach website. She did not tell Dale what she believed. She told him what she knew and what she needed to find out. She needed the complete adoption records for Elliot Hargrove, to the extent they were obtainable. She needed the discharge records from Carver Regional Medical Center for the period surrounding December 19th, 1997. And she needed to know everything about the physician who had attended her delivery. She slid the folder across the table. Dale looked at it for a long moment. He said, "I'll be in touch." She drove home and made dinner and went to bed at 10 o'clock. What Dale found in the first 3 months of his investigation was a set of documents that were individually unremarkable and collectively extraordinary. Elliot Gerald Hargrove had been adopted at the age of approximately 4 months by Gerald and Patricia Hargrove of Savannah, Georgia, through a private adoption arranged by a family services agency called Meridian Infant Placement, which had been licensed in the state of Georgia from 1989 until its voluntary dissolution in 2005. The adoption was legal by every piece of paper associated with it. The infant had been surrendered by a party identified in the records only as a birth mother who had consented to closed adoption. A designation that meant no further identifying information was included in the accessible file. The Hargroves had been vetted, approved, and interviewed over the course of 3 months. Patricia Hargrove had died in 2013. Gerald Hargrove had died in 2018. Elliot Hargrove had no siblings. He had grown up in Savannah, attended public school, graduated from Georgia Tech, earned his MBA at Duke. He had, by every account, been a loved and well-raised child. The physician who had attended Margaret's delivery had been a locum, a temporary covering doctor brought in to fill the gap left by her regular obstetrician's absence that morning. His name was Dr. Harold Vess. He had held a medical license in Georgia from 1988 until 2001, when the license lapsed and was not renewed. He had left Carver Regional in the spring of 1998, approximately 4 months after Margaret's delivery. He had moved to Tennessee. He had worked briefly in a non-clinical administrative role for a healthcare management company before leaving that position as well. He had died in a single vehicle accident outside of Knoxville in June of 2014. When Dale told Margaret this, she was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold in her hands. She set the cup down on the table. She did not say anything for a while. Then she asked Dale to continue. The anomaly in the records from Carver Regional was the most difficult piece to surface and the most significant when it arrived. Dale worked with a medical records specialist who had spent a career in patient advocacy, a woman named Lorraine Fields who knew exactly what to request and exactly how to request it. What the records showed, when they were finally assembled, was a statistical inconsistency in reported infant mortality in the maternity ward between 1994 and 2001. The rate for that period was measurably higher than the regional average for comparable facilities. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have triggered immediate alarm, but consistently, in a pattern that a state health review conducted in 2003 had noted and attributed to patient population factors before closing the file. No further investigation had been opened. Dr. Vess had been the covering physician in 4 of the cases flagged in that review, including Margaret's. 3 of the 4 infants in those cases had been placed through the same adoption agency within 60 days of their reported deaths. Dale presented this information to Margaret on a Saturday afternoon in February in her living room, where she had laid out 3 months of documents across the floor in a sequence that covered most of the available surface and that she had organized with the same system she used for complex client deliverables. By date, then by source, then by implication, she listened to Dale's summary without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. The afternoon light came through the west-facing window and moved slowly across the papers on the floor. She asked Dale 2 questions. The first was whether any of this constituted legal proof of anything. He said no, not yet, and possibly not without DNA evidence, and possibly not even then without a willing complainant and a formal investigation by a state authority. She nodded. The second question was whether he had found any other women. He said he had found 4 names. She asked him to pass them to Lorraine Fields and begin a careful, non-intrusive outreach process. She did not want anyone frightened. She wanted above everything to be precise. It was 9 months into the investigation before Margaret did what she had been building toward from the beginning. She had established her own DNA profile through a private laboratory in Atlanta. A baseline, a biological record, a starting point from which any future comparison could be measured. The test cost her $430, and she paid it in cash. She had also, through channels that Dale and Lorraine had carefully navigated, made contact with 3 of the 4 women on the list. 2 of them had their own version of a doubt they had been carrying for years, a cry that had been explained away, a form signed in exhaustion, a question asked once, and then slowly abandoned. The third had never doubted because she had never been given a reason to, and Margaret spent the better part of a phone call listening to that woman breathe through a silence that grew heavier the longer it went on, and said at the end of it only, "You do not have to decide anything today. Take whatever time you need." The DNA comparison required a sample she could not take herself. She would not take it without consent, and she would not approach Elliot Hargrove directly. Not yet, not without something more than the case she had built, which was compelling and documented, and absolutely not proof of anything a court of law or a human being's sense of themselves would accept as conclusive. What she had was a pattern. What she needed was a fact. Lorraine Fields, whose network within the patient advocacy community was extensive, connected Margaret with a forensic genetic genealogist, a specialist who worked, among other things, on cases where conventional DNA access was not available. The genealogist's name was Dr. Sarah Mbeki, and she worked from an office in a university research park in Athens, Georgia. The 2 women met on a Thursday morning in March. Margaret brought the folder. Dr. Mbeki brought, in addition to her professional expertise, a quality that Margaret recognized immediately and was grateful for. She did not lead with doubt. The process Dr. Mbeki proposed did not require a direct sample from Elliot Hargrove. It required instead a sample from a genetic relative, someone whose biological connection to Margaret would either be confirmed or denied by the comparison. Margaret had one option, her sister, Ellen, who was 4 years older, who lived in Macon still, same neighborhoods, where they had grown up. She had not yet told Ellen anything. She had not told anyone in her family anything. She had kept this the way she kept everything she was not yet ready to lose. Close, private, folded. She drove to Macon on a Sunday in April. She sat at her sister's kitchen table, which was a different kitchen table from the one where they had eaten dinner as girls, but which had the same quality of solidity, the same permanence, and she told Ellen everything from the beginning. Ellen did not say anything until Margaret had finished. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over Margaret's hand. And she said, "What do you need from me?" Ellen provided the sample, so Dr. Mbeki processed it against Margaret's profile and cross-referenced the results against a commercial genealogy database in which Elliot Hargrove had an existing record, entered, apparently, during a period of genealogical curiosity sometime in his early 40s, a detail that Margaret found striking only in retrospect, as if something in him had been asking a question he did not yet know how to formulate. The results came back on a Thursday afternoon in May. Dr. Mbeki called Margaret at home and asked her to sit down, though Margaret was already sitting. She was at the kitchen table, the wooden one she had refinished herself, under the overhead light. Doctor. And Becky told her the results indicated, with a confidence level of greater than 99.9%, a first-degree maternal biological relationship between Margaret Calloway and the individual identified in the database as Elliot Gerald Hargrove. Margaret said thank you. She set the phone down on the table. She sat there for a long time without moving. Outside, the evening was arriving the way evenings do in May. Gently, without announcement, the light changing so slowly you could not say exactly when it had. The legal process that followed was not quick, and it was not simple, and it was not, despite what some people who heard about the case later assumed, driven by anger. Margaret engaged a civil rights attorney named Denise Okafor, who had spent her career in medical patient advocacy and who had, by the time Margaret sat across from her desk, seen enough to understand immediately what they were dealing with. The case was reported to the Georgia Composite Medical Board, to the state health department, and, eventually, after Denise's team made a formal request for investigation, to the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Carver Regional Medical Center had closed in 2011. Its records had been archived with the state. The process of pulling those records and subjecting them to independent forensic review took 8 months and required a court order. Margaret attended every hearing she was legally permitted to attend. She sat in the second row with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and she wrote down everything. 3 of the 4 women on Dale's original list participated in the formal investigation, each having made her own decision in her own time and for her own reasons. A 4th woman, the one who had never had a reason to doubt, was not part of the investigation, but she was not forgotten. Margaret had kept her number. She called her twice during the process, not to persuade her of anything, but simply to let her know that the process was happening, and that she was not alone in it, whatever she decided. This is the part of the story that those who heard it later found most difficult to fully accept, that the woman at the center of it, the woman who had the most to gain from speed and urgency and pressure, was the one most committed to making sure no one felt pressured. Margaret Calloway had spent 22 years being managed by people who meant well. She was not going to do that to anyone else. She approached Elliot Hargrove before the investigation became public. This was a decision she made with Denise's guidance, but from her own conviction. She did not want him to learn what she had found from a legal document or a news report or a colleague who had seen something on a government database. She wanted him to hear it from her. They met on a Saturday morning in a coffee shop that was neither near his home nor her office. She arrived first and sat with a glass of water, and when he walked in, she stood. He had not known, when she requested the meeting, what it was about. She had told him only that it was personal and important. He sat across from her and she told him. She did not rush. She did not apologize. She told him everything she had found, in the order she had found it, and she left the documents on the table between them. She said, at the end, I have not made any demands and I will not make any. This is yours to do with as you decide. He sat across from her and did not speak for a very long time. He looked at the documents. He looked at the birthmark on his own forearm as if seeing it for the first time. What Elliot Hargrove did in the weeks and months after that conversation is something he has not spoken about publicly, and Margaret has been precise about respecting that. What is known is that he cooperated with the investigation. He provided a formal DNA sample that confirmed, legally and medically and without any remaining ambiguity, what doctor, and Becky's results had already shown. He also made a personal statement, not for publication, not for the legal file, but for Margaret, that she has never shared in full. She has said only that he was not what she feared he would be, and that what she feared most was that he would be angry. He was not angry. He was, she said, the most honest she had ever seen anyone be in the presence of information they had not chosen and could not change. She said he reminded her, in that quality of honesty, of her grandfather. She did not tell him that. She kept it in the pocket where she kept the things she was not yet ready to lose. The investigation resulted in a formal finding by the state of Georgia that Carver Regional Medical Center had, between 1994 and 2001, been the site of a systematic falsification of infant mortality records in at least 6 confirmed cases, with an additional 4 cases classified as inconclusive, pending further document analysis. The mechanism, a locum physician, a licensed private adoption agency, a financial lesson that the state investigators described as carefully structured to leave no single party holding unambiguous criminal liability, had been designed, whether consciously or by the accumulation of small decisions, to survive exactly the kind of scrutiny that grief makes difficult to sustain. It had survived for 22 years. It had survived because the people most harmed by it were the people least positioned to pursue it. Young women, often without resources or institutional support, told by figures of medical authority that their grief was real and their memory was not. Margaret Calloway had been the exception. She had resources, and she had patience, and she had never, not once, let the memory go. The four women involved in the confirmed cases have all been offered and accepted varying forms of legal settlement through the state's patient compensation process. Margaret's settlement was not the largest. She did not negotiate on the basis of money. She negotiated on the basis of one condition, that the investigation's findings be made part of the permanent state health record, and that the methodology used to identify the cases be formalized as a protocol for future pattern review in archived maternity records. Denise Okafor, who had spent her career building cases that changed systems rather than just compensating individuals, described this as the most sophisticated set of settlement terms she had negotiated in 27 years of practice. She said it in a hallway outside the state offices on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, and Margaret nodded and said she was glad, and then she asked if Denise wanted to get lunch, because she had not eaten since early that morning, and she was very hungry. And the resolution of a 22-year question, it turned out, did not suppress the appetite. Margaret Calloway and Elliot Hargrove have met a total of 7 times in the 2 years since the investigation concluded. This is information she shared in the same brief written statement released through her attorney, the only public account she has provided. She said they were building something and that they did not yet have a name for it. What she meant by that was not mysterious. The vocabulary for what they are to each other does not exist in the tidy categories available. Not mother and son in the way the phrase usually lands, not strangers, not quite anything that a language built for ordinary relationships can hold cleanly. They are two people who share a biology and a wound, and the particular quiet understanding of what it means to have your life shaped by something that was done before you were old enough to consent to it. They sit across from each other, sometimes in that coffee shop where she first told him, sometimes elsewhere, and they talk. It is enough, for now. It is more than she had for 22 years. What stays with you when you sit with this story long enough is not the crime. Crimes have a logic, even terrible ones, a motive, a mechanism, an end. What stays with you is the image of a woman who kept a memory that everyone around her, with love and with the best intentions in the world, kept asking her to release. She did not release it. She held it for 22 years in the quiet way that the most disciplined grief holds the things it cannot yet prove, not with rage, not with noise, but with the kind of patient, unbreakable insistence that looks, from the outside, very much like acceptance. It was not acceptance. It was the decision to be the one person in the room who did not stop believing that the truth, however long it took, was still there waiting to be found. She drove to a new job on an ordinary spring morning. She took an elevator. She collected a visitor badge. And the thing she had never stopped looking for looked up from a document and rested its arm on the edge of a conference table. 22 years. A birthmark on an arm. And a woman who had learned through the long practice of refusing to forget that patience is not the same as giving up. It is simply a different way of not letting go.